Cassandra Whitmore stood in the middle of a federal courtroom in Manhattan, the mop still in her hands, as the entire room fell into silence. "I'll defend him," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. Her thin fingers clenched the mop handle as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. At the defense table, Gabriel Thornton, the most notorious mafia boss in New York, whose own team of 8 attorneys had just abandoned him in unison, lifted his head and looked at her with cold gray eyes that, for the first time, flickered with something else: curiosity. None of them knew that this simple moment would mark the beginning of an unraveling, the exposure of one of the darkest conspiracies in the history of New York's upper crust, a conspiracy that had stolen the life of the husband she loved 7 years earlier. Before we go deeper into this emotional story of justice, courage, and unexpected love, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you believe that anyone, whether a powerful kingpin or a quiet janitor, deserves a second chance in life, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stories about people who rise from the ashes the way Cassandra did deserve to be told, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's look at what made a brilliant female attorney, once crushed by the system, dare to stand up and protect the very man the whole world calls a criminal. But before everything began to change, what do you think drove Cassandra, a woman who had lost almost everything, to step out of the shadows at that fateful moment? If this story touches your heart, tap like to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that hope is always there. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moving stories to come. 7 years ago, Cassandra Whitmore wasn't the woman standing in a courtroom with a mop in her hands. She was a rising star at Harvard Law School, the valedictorian, with a dazzling future stretched out in front of her. One of her professors used to say, Cassandra had something money couldn't buy: an instinct for the law, a gift for seeing the cracks in an argument that everyone else overlooked, and, more than anything, a heart that never made peace with injustice. At 23, she received offers from 3 of New York's top law firms, each one promising a 6-figure salary and a fast track to success. But Cassandra didn't choose money or prestige. She chose Ethan Whitmore. Ethan was 5 years older, a human rights attorney working for a small nonprofit in Manhattan. He wasn't wealthy, and he wasn't powerful, but he had the warmest brown eyes Cassandra had ever seen, and a fierce belief that the law existed to protect the vulnerable, not to serve the rich. They met during a hearing where Cassandra was there as an intern, and from the moment Ethan stood up to defend a homeless man who'd been falsely accused of theft, she knew she'd found the man of her life. Their wedding took place in a small church in Brooklyn, with only 20 guests, no expensive gown, no lavish reception. But when Ethan held her hand and spoke his vows, Cassandra felt like the happiest woman in the world. They rented a small apartment in Queens, just enough space for 2 people and their oversized dreams. Ethan kept doing his work, and Cassandra joined her husband's firm as a trainee attorney. Life wasn't abundant, but they had each other, and that was enough. Then everything changed when Ethan took a case against Cole Enterprises. Harrison Cole was one of the most powerful men in America, the chief executive officer of a massive energy conglomerate with tangled connections throughout politics and finance. A former employee of Cole came to Ethan with evidence that the company was trafficking illegal weapons, laundering money through sham charitable projects, and was even linked to the deaths of people who dared to speak out against them. Ethan knew it was the most dangerous case of his career, but he couldn't turn away. Cassandra still remembered their last night together, Ethan at his desk long past midnight, surrounded by hundreds of pages of documents. She brought him a cup of coffee and asked if he was sure he wanted to keep going. Ethan looked at her with eyes heavy with exhaustion but lit with determination, and he said that if he didn't do it, no one else would. That justice doesn't arrive on its own. Someone has to fight for it. Those were the last words she ever heard from her husband. The next morning, on his way to court, Ethan's car spun out of control and plunged into the Hudson River. The police ruled it an accident caused by a blown tire. But Cassandra knew the truth. She knew because only 1 week after Ethan's funeral, every piece of evidence in the Cole Enterprises case vanished from the office. And 2 weeks after that, she was accused of forging legal documents, conspiring to commit fraud, and obstructing justice. The hearing moved so fast it felt unreal. Witnesses Cassandra had never met took the stand and swore they'd seen her fabricate evidence. Emails she had never written were submitted as proof. The attorney she hired withdrew at the last possible moment, and the replacement seemed to be working for the other side more than defending her. In the end, Cassandra was stripped of her license to practice law, barred from setting foot in any courtroom as counsel. She lost everything in less than 2 months: her husband, her career, her name, her future. But the most brutal part still wasn't over. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 18, leaving her and her younger sister Maddie, who was only 12 then, to survive on their own. Cassandra had spent her entire youth studying and working, raising her sister while chasing a dream. Now, with her reputation destroyed and not a dollar saved, she had to find a way to feed them both. No law firm would take her. No company wanted to hire someone accused of fraud. In the end, the only job she could find was as a janitor at the federal courthouse in Manhattan, the very courthouse where Ethan had once fought for justice, the place where their dream had died. 7 years later, Cassandra Whitmore's life began at 4 o'clock every morning, when New York City was still drowned in darkness, and the streets of the Bronx were so empty they felt eerie. Her studio apartment sat on the 5th floor of a worn-down building, where the elevator was broken more often than it worked, and the sound of rats skittering inside the walls had become the familiar soundtrack of every night. The room was only about 20 square meters, just enough space for a narrow single bed, a tiny kitchen with 2 gas burners, and a corner she called the living room only because she'd placed an old chair there, one she'd hauled in from the curb. The rent was $1,800 a month, taking a significant portion of the $4,200 she earned as a senior maintenance staff member, including overtime shifts. What was left, she broke down into smaller pieces, for electricity, water, subway fare, and food. In lucky months, she still had a little left over to send to Maddie, even though her sister always refused to take it. Cassandra didn't turn on the lights when she woke. She was used to the dark, and besides, a winter electric bill was enough to force her to skip lunch for an entire week if she wasn't careful. In the dim glow of streetlight leaking through the window, she felt her way to the kitchen, boiled a kettle, and made black coffee. No sugar, no milk. Breakfast was 2 slices of bread gone slightly hard, the kind she bought at a discount from the bakery on the corner every Saturday night. While she waited for the water to boil, Cassandra stood in front of the only wall that held anything at all. It was a wedding photo in a simple wooden frame, the only thing she'd carried with her from the old apartment in Queens after she lost everything. In the picture, Ethan was smiling, those warm brown eyes looking at her as if she were his entire world. And she was 23, her hair pinned up, wearing a plain white dress borrowed from a secondhand shop, yet smiling so brightly it was as if she owned everything in life. 7 years had passed, and Cassandra still spoke to that photograph every morning. Today, as always, she whispered that she was still here, still waiting, still holding on, still not forgetting the promise she'd made. She would find the truth, and she would make the people who stole his life pay for it. Her phone vibrated, pulling her out of that silent conversation with the dead. A message from Maddie, her sister, now 19, in her 2nd year studying information technology at New York University on a prestigious full-ride scholarship. The message said, "Don't send money this month. I just got a part-time job in the lab. The pay is enough to live on. You keep it, and buy something warm. It's so cold." Cassandra smiled, a rare expression on a face that had forgotten how to show feeling a long time ago. Maddie was always like that, stubborn and independent, exactly the way Cassandra had once been. Cassandra texted back, "You just focus on school. I'll handle the money," and set the phone down knowing Maddie wouldn't listen. At 5 o'clock, Cassandra stepped out of the apartment, her breath turning into pale white smoke in the winter cold of New York. She walked 15 minutes to the subway station, pressed in among other early shift workers, and began the hour-long journey to the federal courthouse in Manhattan. People often asked why she didn't find a job closer to home, why she put herself through a commute that long, that exhausting. She never answered, because the truth was, Cassandra chose to work in this courthouse not because she needed the money, even though she did, but because this was where Ethan had fought. This was where he had stood up for the vulnerable, where he had believed in justice until his very last breath. Every day she mopped these hallways. Every day she watched trials unfold. She reminded herself of the vow she'd whispered before that wedding photograph, that she would never forget, never forgive, and never stop until Harrison Cole paid for what he had done. To the world, Cassandra Whitmore was only an invisible janitor, a ghost slipping through courthouse corridors that no one bothered to see. But inside her, the fire still smoldered, waiting for the day it could finally blaze. While Cassandra Whitmore began her new day with black coffee and stale bread inside a cramped apartment in the Bronx, not far away, on the 60th floor of Thornton Tower, Gabriel Thornton stood before a wall of glass, looking down at Manhattan, as it slowly woke. He was 36 years old, 1 meter and 85 centimeters tall, with neatly cropped black hair and steel, cold gray eyes, the kind of gaze that could make even the most stubborn men lower their heads. On paper, Gabriel Thornton was the chief executive officer of Thornton Industries, a diversified conglomerate with an estimated value of around $8 billion, operating in real estate, technology, and finance. Forbes magazine had once placed him on its list of the most successful self-made entrepreneurs in America under 40, but that was only the surface of the iceberg. In the underworld, the name Gabriel Thornton carried a completely different meaning. He was the leader of the Thornton Syndicate, a shadow empire that controlled nearly 40% of illegal operations on the east coast of the United States. From underground gambling to loan sharking, from protection rackets to money laundering, there wasn't a single corner where the Thornton Syndicate's hand didn't reach. Yet what set Gabriel apart from other mafia bosses, what made both allies and enemies respect him and hate him, were the unbreakable principles he'd laid down. No drugs, no human trafficking, no harm to civilians. Those 3 rules were carved into the bones of every member of the Thornton Syndicate, and anyone who violated them paid with their life. Gabriel once told Ronan Steele, his head of security and the most trusted right hand at his side, that he wasn't a saint, that he did what society called crimes, but he'd never touch the things that destroyed the human soul. Drugs killed the future of the young. Human trafficking turned people into merchandise. Those were lines Gabriel would never cross, no matter how enormous the profit. And it was precisely these principles that made him a thorn in the side of Harrison Cole, chief executive officer of Cole Enterprises, and one of the most ruthless men in New York's upper crust. Cole controlled a transnational illegal weapons pipeline, maintained close ties with high-level politicians, and never hesitated to eliminate anyone who dared to block his path. 15 years earlier, Gabriel's younger sister, a girl of only 17 named Lily, had died in a strange car accident simply because she'd accidentally witnessed one of Cole's delivery deals. That was the day Gabriel Thornton stepped into the underworld, not for money or power, but for one purpose alone: revenge. But Gabriel wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He knew Cole was an old fox with a vast web of connections, and that a direct strike would only lead him into a trap. So he patiently built his own empire, step by step, waiting for the day Cole would expose a weakness. And now, Cole had chosen to strike first. The lawsuit Cole Enterprises filed against Gabriel was a vicious blow, carefully calculated. They accused him of laundering money through real estate projects, committing securities fraud, and bribing officials to win contracts. The evidence presented looked convincing, with internal documents, witnesses who were former employees, and even leaked emails. Gabriel knew it was all fabricated, meticulously staged by Cole's team. But he also knew that in a courtroom, the truth didn't always win. If he lost, it would be 30 years in prison and the seizure of all his assets. The empire he'd built with such effort would collapse, and Cole would take everything, including the 3 major ports Thornton Industries owned. The key to the weapons smuggling route Cole had coveted for a long time. Gabriel could have dealt with the case through underworld power. One phone call, and the witnesses against him would disappear. One secret meeting, and the judge would stand on his side. But he didn't do it, because if he moved in the shadows, Cole would remain safely outside the light. Gabriel wanted more than that. He wanted Cole to feel certain he was winning, so certain that he'd reveal every true face and every dark scheme. He wanted Cole dragged into the light and destroyed before the entire world, not by a bullet in the dark, but by the very legal system Cole had once manipulated. That was why Gabriel accepted going to court, accepted facing manufactured accusations, and accepted waiting for the right moment. What he didn't expect was that the moment would arrive in the shape of a woman he had often dismissed as part of the background, a ghost in the corridors he had consciously ignored to focus on his own war. That morning, when Gabriel Thornton walked into the courtroom in a black suit worth $10,000, he didn't know fate had arranged a meeting that would change both their lives forever. Courtroom 302 of the federal courthouse in Manhattan was packed at 9 o'clock that morning. Reporters from every major news outlet were crammed into the back rows, cameras and notepads poised, ready to capture every second of the most anticipated trial of the year. The case of Gabriel Thornton, the most mysterious kingpin in New York, was a feast for the media, and no one wanted to miss it. Gabriel entered the courtroom with his usual calm, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, his gray eyes sweeping the room once before settling on the defense table. But when he looked toward the seats reserved for his legal team, his heart sank. 8 chairs sat empty, Not a single attorney had shown up. Gabriel pulled out his phone and called Jonathan Mercer, the lead counsel he'd paid millions of dollars to secure from the most prestigious firm in the city. No answer. He called the second, then the third, then the fourth. Every line fell into silence. Finally, a message from Mercer appeared on the screen, brief and brutal. He was sorry. His family had been threatened. He couldn't continue, and Gabriel would have to handle it himself. Gabriel tightened his grip on the phone until his knuckles went white. Cole. This was Harrison Cole's game. He'd expected Cole to play dirty, but he hadn't imagined this level of audacity, threatening all 8 lawyers at once, forcing them to withdraw right before the hearing, leaving him no time to find replacements. This was no longer a legal battle. This was a slaughter arranged in advance. On the other side of the courtroom, Prosecutor Richard Graves watched the defense table with a smile thin as a blade. Graves was a man in his 40s, salt and pepper hair slicked neatly back, narrow eyes that always pinched even tighter when he was pleased, an expression Gabriel had despised from the first moment they met. Graves didn't bother hiding his satisfaction at the sight of those 8 empty chairs. He knew. He'd known this was coming. Maybe he was part of the plot himself, bought by Cole to make sure Gabriel had no way out. The back door opened, and Judge Margaret Chen entered. She was a woman close to 60, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her face stern, respected throughout the legal world for being fair and unforgiving. Gabriel had once hoped that with a judge like her, he'd have a real shot at a fair hearing, but now, with no counsel, that hope was dissolving by the second. The courtroom rose as Judge Chen took her seat. Her eyes moved over the room, then paused on the defense table with its empty chairs, and her brows drew together. She asked where Mr. Thornton's attorneys were, where his legal team had gone. Gabriel stood. His voice stayed steady, even as a storm roared inside him, and he said that, Your Honor, his attorneys had withdrawn. He was trying to reach them, but no one was answering. Graves rose at once, his voice ringing with practiced hypocrisy, as he said that, Your Honor, the defendant had clearly been abandoned by his legal team, and he moved that the court proceed without defense counsel or enter a default judgment. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Reporters hammered at their keyboards like mad. Gabriel stood there, alone among wolves, and for the first time in many years, he felt the board tipping hard toward his enemy. Judge Chen looked at the clock, her face showing the immense pressure from the administrative board to conclude this high-profile case today. As the prosecution pushed for an immediate default judgment due to the defendant's lack of counsel, she sighed and said that if the defendant had no legal representative, the court would have to proceed, but she didn't get to finish. A voice rose from the back of the room, clear and trembling, yet loud enough to make everyone turn. I'll defend him. And that was the moment Gabriel Thornton saw her, the woman holding a mop, standing in the aisle, the woman he'd passed hundreds of times without noticing even once. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze in that instant. Every gaze swung toward the woman standing in the aisle, still in a navy blue janitorial uniform with the word maintenance embroidered across her chest, still holding a mop as if she'd stepped in from a completely different world. A ripple of giggling began in the back, tentative at first, then swelling as people grasped the absurdity of it. A janitor wanted to serve as defense counsel for the most powerful mafia boss in New York. Was this supposed to be a joke? But Cassandra didn't laugh. She lowered the mop to the floor slowly, every movement steady, deliberate, as if she were placing down the last prop of a life she no longer intended to live. Then she walked forward, spine straight, eyes fixed on Judge Chen, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt like she was truly living, instead of merely surviving. Judge Chen stared at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion, her tone firm as she asked who she was, and whether she understood that this was a federal court, not a place for games. Cassandra stopped at the lectern. Her voice still trembled slightly, but it wasn't weak, when she answered that her name was Cassandra Whitmore, Your Honor, and she was requesting permission to represent Mr. Gabriel Thornton. Richard Graves let out a sharp laugh, the laugh of a man who believed victory was already in his hand. He rose, his voice dripping with mockery as he said that, Your Honor, this was clearly a farce. A janitor had no standing to be in this courtroom as an attorney, and he moved that security escort her out. Cassandra didn't turn to look at Graves. She reached slowly into her pocket and produced a crisp, laminated card, its edges sharp and clean, bearing the official seal of the New York Bar Association. This is my license to practice law, she said, her voice calmer now, still valid under the laws of the state of New York. Judge Chen motioned for the clerk to bring it up. She put on her reading glasses, examined every detail on the card, then typed something into the computer in front of her to check the system. The room went so quiet Cassandra could hear her own heartbeat. After minutes that stretched like centuries, Judge Chen looked up, and something shifted across her face. No longer simple doubt, but something close to astonishment. She said that, according to the record, this license had been reinstated 2 years earlier, after Miss Whitmore proved her innocence in the prior frame-up case, and she asked why Cassandra hadn't practiced for the past 2 years. Cassandra explained that although her license was reinstated, Harrison Cole's influence had blocked her from every firm. More importantly, she chose to stay in the shadows of this specific courthouse, using her invisibility to gather the fragments of evidence that the system had tried to bury. At the prosecution table, Richard Graves suddenly lurched to his feet, his face draining pale as if he'd just seen a ghost. Whitmore. The name rang in his mind like an alarm bell. Now he remembered. 7 years earlier, he'd been one of the assistant prosecutors assigned to the case against Cole Enterprises, the case Ethan Whitmore had been investigating before he died. He remembered the midnight phone calls, the envelopes of cash, and the promise that if he followed instructions, his career would soar. And now, the widow of Ethan Whitmore was standing right in front of him. Graves forced himself to regain control, his voice still trying to sound contemptuous as he said that, "Your Honor, even if she had a license, she had no real-world experience in 7 years, and she wasn't qualified to handle a case as complex as this." Cassandra turned to look at Graves for the first time, her green eyes sharp as a blade as she answered that she'd graduated valedictorian from Harvard Law School. She'd practiced for 3 years before she was framed, and she'd spent the last 7 years in this courthouse every day, watching hundreds of trials, learning from the best attorneys and from the worst mistakes. And she might not have experience on paper, but she knew the law. She knew justice, and she knew the truth. At the defense table, Gabriel Thornton sat as still as stone, but inside him something violent and wordless was moving. He was the best information controller in New York. He had files on everyone in this courthouse, from the judge to the clerk, from the prosecutor to the guards. But he had nothing on this woman. She was a janitor, a ghost moving through hallways no one bothered to see, and that very invisibility had let her slip past every one of his radars. For the first time in his life, Gabriel Thornton was genuinely surprised. Judge Chen looked toward him and asked whether Mr. Thornton accepted Miss Whitmore as his legal representative. Gabriel rose, his gray eyes meeting Cassandra's green. In that look, he didn't see ambition. He didn't see fear. He saw only the resolve of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. He nodded and answered, "Yes, Your Honor." He accepted Miss Whitmore. Judge Chen brought down her gavel and announced that the defendant would have 15 minutes to consult with defense counsel before the proceedings continued. Cassandra and Gabriel were escorted into a small room behind the courtroom, a place with nothing but a metal table, 2 chairs facing each other, and a fluorescent bulb that cast the cold, sterile light of an interrogation room. The door shut behind them, and for the first time, the 2 of them faced each other in a tight space without hundreds of eyes watching. Gabriel didn't sit. He stood with his back against the wall, steel, cold, gray eyes sweeping Cassandra from head to toe. She was still in her janitor's uniform, auburn hair slipping loose from the hurried bun she'd thrown up that morning, her face bare of any makeup at all. She looked tired, too thin, and nothing like any attorney Gabriel had ever hired. But in those green eyes, he saw something money couldn't buy, a fire smoldering under the surface, waiting for its chance to flare. Gabriel spoke first, his voice low and even, as if he were asking about the weather instead of interrogating the woman who now held his fate in her hands. "Do you know who I really am?" Gabriel asked, his voice dropping an octave. Cassandra didn't blink. She met his gaze and answered that he was Gabriel Thornton, Chief Executive Officer of Thornton Industries, with an estimated net worth of $8 billion. But that was only the surface. He was also the leader of the Thornton Syndicate, an underworld empire controlling nearly 40% of illegal operations on the East Coast, from gambling to loan sharking, from protection rackets to money laundering. But no drugs, no human trafficking, those were his rules. She knew all of it. For the first time in the conversation, Gabriel tilted his head slightly, a small sign she'd caught his attention. He asked how she knew those things. Cassandra said she'd worked in this courthouse for 7 years. She'd heard thousands of conversations people thought no one could hear. She'd read hundreds of documents tossed away in the trash. She'd watched everyone who moved through these corridors, including him. And for an invisible janitor, Mr. Thornton, that was her greatest advantage. Gabriel fell silent for a long moment, his mind processing at a dizzying speed. Then he asked the one question that mattered most. Why did she want to defend a mafia boss? Cassandra drew a deep breath. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The moment she would finally speak the truth she'd carried for 7 years. She wasn't defending him, she said, her voice shaking slightly but never weakening. She was defending justice, and this case smelled exactly like the case that had killed her husband 7 years ago. Gabriel's brow tightened. Your husband, he repeated. Cassandra nodded, her eyes bright, but not a single tear fell. Ethan Whitmore, she said, her husband. A human rights attorney who'd investigated Cole Enterprises 7 years earlier. He'd uncovered that Harrison Cole was trafficking illegal weapons, laundering money through charities, and linked to multiple assassinations. He'd had enough evidence to take Cole to court, but the day before the hearing, his car lost control and plunged into the Hudson River. The police called it an accident, but she knew it was murder. Gabriel straightened, his gray eyes darkening. He knew about Ethan Whitmore. He knew because he'd been investigating Cole for years, and the death of that young attorney was one of dozens he suspected Cole had ordered. But he hadn't expected the widow of that man to be standing here now, in a janitor's uniform, offering to defend him in court. Cassandra went on, her voice harder now. After Ethan died, all the evidence disappeared. She was framed for forging documents. Her law license was taken. She lost everything. The same playbook. Mr. Thornton. Bribed witnesses. Manufactured evidence. Threatened attorneys. Cole had done it to her husband 7 years ago, and now he was doing it to him. Gabriel stepped closer, until there was less than a meter between them. He asked what she wanted from this. Money, reputation, or something else. Cassandra didn't move back. She lifted her chin and looked him straight in the eye as she answered that she wanted justice for her husband. She wanted Harrison Cole to pay for what he'd done, not only to Ethan but to everyone he'd harmed. She didn't need his money. She didn't need fame. She only needed a chance to fight. Gabriel narrowed his eyes, his voice turning colder as he said that if she worked for him, she would have to follow his strategy. He had his own plan to deal with Cole, and she couldn't do anything outside what he allowed. Cassandra shook her head. No, she said at once, her voice hard as steel. She was his attorney, not his puppet, and she wouldn't do anything against her conscience or the law just because he ordered it. If he wanted a puppet, he could find someone else. The air in the room thickened until it felt like it could be cut with a knife. They stood facing each other, neither giving an inch, neither lowering their head. Gabriel Thornton, the most powerful kingpin in New York, the man the entire underworld feared, facing Cassandra Whitmore, a penniless janitor with a heart that didn't know fear. At last, Gabriel gave a short, dry laugh, and for the first time, something almost like respect flickered in those gray eyes. All right, Miss Whitmore, he said. We share the same enemy, so let's see what you can do. 15 minutes passed like 15 seconds. When Cassandra and Gabriel stepped back into the courtroom, the air was still tight as a drawn wire. Reporters leaned forward, jurors traded curious looks, and Richard Graves sat there with a sneer, as if waiting for a comedy to begin. Cassandra glanced down at the janitor's uniform she was still wearing, then looked across at Graves in a 3-piece suit that probably cost more than her entire month's pay. She knew how she looked to them. A joke, the desperation of someone with no other choice. But she also knew appearances weren't everything, and today she would prove it. Judge Chen struck the gavel and announced the trial would continue, instructing the defense to give its opening statement. Cassandra rose and walked to the lectern with the straight-backed posture she drilled into her bones through 3 years at Harvard. She had no notes, no prepared documents, only the memory of 7 years of watching and a heart packed tight with determination. She placed both hands on the wooden podium, felt the cool surface under her palms, then lifted her head and looked directly at the 12 faces of the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her clear voice carrying through the room. I apologize for my appearance. I'm not wearing an expensive suit like counsel on the other side. I don't have a luxury office, or a staff of assistants. In fact, less than an hour ago, I was still mopping the floor of this very room. A murmur rose, but Cassandra didn't stop. She went on, saying that in the past 7 years she had learned one thing. Justice doesn't depend on the price tag of the suit you wear. It doesn't depend on the name of the law firm you hire or the amount in your bank account. Justice depends on only one thing, the truth. She paused just long enough to let the words settle, then continued. And the truth in this case is very simple. Gabriel Thornton did not commit the crimes he's accused of. The evidence you will see has been carefully manufactured. The witnesses you will hear have been coached to say what others want them to say. This is not justice. This is an assassination carried out through the law, and I will prove it." Richard Graves shot to his feet, his objection nearly a shout, claiming she was arguing instead of delivering an opening statement. Judge Chen nodded and instructed Cassandra to stay within the proper scope of opening remarks. Cassandra dipped her head in acknowledgement. She said she apologized to the court, she would let the evidence speak for itself, and she promised the jury only this: when this trial ended, the truth would be exposed, and they would know who the real criminal in this room truly was. She returned to her seat, her heart pounding in her chest while her face remained composed. At the defense table, Gabriel looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, but he gave a slight nod, a small gesture, yet enough to tell her she'd done the right thing. The rest of the morning belonged to Prosecutor Graves. He called his first witness, a middle-aged man named Harold Simmons, who claimed to be the former chief accountant of Thornton Industries. Simmons testified that he had witnessed Gabriel Thornton personally directing money laundering transactions from January through March of 2021, that there were secret meetings, offshore bank accounts, and direct orders from the chief executive officer. Graves wore a satisfied smile as he finished his examination, then turned to Cassandra with a look of challenge. "Your turn." Cassandra stood, carrying a thin file she'd managed to request from the court clerk during the recess. She walked toward the witness stand, her voice gentle but sharp, as she asked Mr. Simmons to confirm the dates of his employment at Thornton Industries. Simmons answered confidently that he'd worked there from December of 2020 through April of 2021. Cassandra nodded, then asked, "And you just testified that you witnessed money laundering transactions from January through March of 2021. "Correct." Simmons confirmed it. Cassandra opened the file in her hands. Her voice stayed calm, yet something in it cut like a blade as she said that was interesting, because according to the official human resources record of Thornton Industries, Harold Simmons was hired on April 15, 2021, which was after the period he claimed he witnessed illegal transactions, and she asked if he could explain how he had witnessed events that occurred before he ever began working there. Simmons's face went white as paper. He stammered, glanced toward Graves as if pleading for rescue, but the prosecutor was frozen in his chair. Cassandra didn't let go. She continued, "And one more thing. According to the record, his position at Thornton Industries was building maintenance staff, not chief accountant. And did he want to explain that to the jury?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs and the frantic clatter of reporters' keyboards. Simmons trembled on the stand, sweat breaking across his forehead, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Judge Chen had to strike the gavel several times to restore order. Gabriel Thornton sat at the defense table, his gray eyes locked on Cassandra. He'd hired dozens of the most expensive lawyers in New York in his life, but no one had ever impressed him the way this woman had. She had no prepared binder, no research team, yet she'd found a hole that an entire $1 million legal squad had missed. For the first time, Gabriel didn't look at Cassandra as a tool or a piece on his board. He looked at her as a fighter, an equal, and perhaps the first true ally he'd ever had in this war. The first day of trial ended at 5 o'clock in the evening, but Cassandra's day didn't stop there. When she stepped out of the courthouse, a glossy black Maybach was already waiting at the curb, and Ronan Steele, Gabriel's head of security, the one she'd heard about for a long time, stood there holding the door open with a blank expression. "Mr. Thornton wants to see you to discuss the case," Ronan said, his voice low and even, as if this were an order that couldn't be refused. Cassandra hesitated for a moment, then got into the car. She had nothing left to lose, and if Gabriel had information about Cole, she needed to know it. The ride from the courthouse to Thornton Tower took only 15 minutes, but it was 15 minutes long enough for Cassandra to feel the distance between two worlds. The seat beneath her was butter soft leather. The climate control held the air at a perfect temperature. A bottle of imported mineral water waited in the door pocket. She thought of her cramped apartment in the Bronx, of the old chair she'd dragged in from the sidewalk, of winter nights spent shivering because she didn't dare turn on the heat, and she wondered whether worlds this far apart could ever find common ground. A private elevator carried her up to the 60th floor of Thornton Tower, where Gabriel's penthouse took the entire level. When the doors opened, Cassandra had to swallow back a sharp breath. The penthouse was more than 50 times the size of her apartment, with soaring ceilings, gleaming marble floors, and a massive wall of glass looking out over Manhattan as the city lit up. Abstract paintings worth millions hung on the walls. A crystal chandelier shimmered overhead. Everything radiated a kind of wealth, so extreme, it felt almost unreal. Gabriel stood by the glass, his back to her, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He'd swapped the courtroom suit for a black shirt with no tie, and under the warm golden light, he looked less icy, but the power around him still made it impossible to take him lightly. "You impressed me today," Gabriel said without turning, his voice low, carrying through the wide space. "That witness was trained well, but you caught a gap my whole team missed." Cassandra didn't answer the compliment. She walked farther in, her eyes sweeping the room with the guarded instinct of someone who'd learned what betrayal costs. "You said you wanted to talk about the case," she said bluntly. "So talk." Gabriel turned, his gray eyes meeting her green ones in a moment of silence. Then he moved to his desk, opened a safe hidden behind a painting, and took out a thick file. He set it on the table and said this was everything he had on Harrison Cole, collected over 15 years, and he wanted her to read it. Cassandra sat down, opened the file, and began to read. Every page was a crime. Illegal weapons sales to terrorist organizations. Money laundering through a web of shell companies stretching from Delaware to the Cayman Islands. Bribes paid to 3 senators and 2 federal judges to protect business interests. And a list of the people who died for daring to oppose Cole. Deaths disguised as accidents, suicides, or sudden illness. Then Cassandra turned to a page that made her heart feel as if it stopped. Ethan Whitmore, attorney, investigated Cole Enterprises. Died on April 12, 2018. Official cause was a car accident. Real cause was assassination ordered by Harrison Cole. Method was sabotage of the braking system. Cassandra's hands began to shake beyond her control. For 7 years, she'd known Ethan's death wasn't an accident. She'd felt it in every cell of her body. But seeing it written there, in black ink on white paper, with concrete, detailed evidence, was something else entirely. Tears spilled before she could stop them. The first tears she'd cried for Ethan since the funeral 7 years earlier. She'd locked that pain inside her chest, turned it into fuel for the fire of hatred. But now, with the truth lying in front of her, every wall she'd built came down. Gabriel didn't speak. He stood in silence and gave her space to be with her grief. He understood that feeling, the knowledge that someone you love was murdered while the one responsible still walked free beyond the reach of the law. His sister, Lily, had died in a similar way 15 years earlier. After a long time, Cassandra lifted her head, eyes red, but her voice had found its hardness again. She asked why he hadn't used all of this to destroy Cole. Gabriel said that if he used the underworld to handle Cole, Cole would die as a victim, and people would remember him as a businessman assassinated by the Mafia. And Gabriel didn't want that. He wanted Cole dragged into the light, tried in court, his true face shown to the entire world. He wanted him to rot in prison until the day he died, not to be released by a bullet. Cassandra looked at him, and for the first time she understood Gabriel Thornton wasn't only the cold Mafia boss the world believed him to be. He was a man waiting for justice in his own way. "So what's the strategy?" she asked. Gabriel said they would win this case legally, while gathering enough evidence that the Federal Bureau of Investigation couldn't ignore it. Cole thought he was winning, and that was his greatest weakness. When people are confident, they get careless, and they would use every careless moment. Cassandra made it back to her apartment in the Bronx close to 11 o'clock at night, after refusing Gabriel's offer to stay at the penthouse for safety. She needed time alone to digest what she'd just read, needed the familiar space of that tiny room to find her balance again. But when she opened the door, the light was already on, and Maddie was sitting in the old chair with a laptop open on her thighs, her face tense, as if she'd been waiting for a long time. "Sis," Maddie blurted, jumping to her feet the second she saw Cassandra. "I saw it online. You're acting as the lawyer for Gabriel Thornton, that Mafia boss. Have you lost your mind?" Cassandra shut the door and let out a long, exhausted breath. She looked at her sister, the 12-year-old girl from back then, now a 19-year-old young woman with short brown hair cut to her shoulders, green eyes just like Cassandra's, and the same stubbornness the Whitmores were born with. Maddie wore an oversized university hoodie, faded jeans, and sneakers worn down at the heel. But the laptop in her hands was the most valuable thing in the apartment, bought with part-time wages and scholarships for an outstanding information technology student at New York University. "Sit down, Maddie," Cassandra said, her voice softer, but still weighted with the fatigue of a brutal day. "I'll explain everything." And she did. She told Maddie the whole story, from Cole Enterprises filing suit against Gabriel, to his legal team being threatened and abandoning him, to why Cassandra stood up in that courtroom that morning. But more than anything, she told her about Ethan. She told Maddie what she'd read in Gabriel's file, the evidence that proved his death wasn't an accident but a targeted assassination, that Harrison Cole was behind it all. Maddie sat in silence through the entire story, her face turning paler with every detail. She remembered Ethan, her brother-in-law, the gentle man who'd helped her with homework every night, who'd bought her first computer and sparked her love for technology, who'd promised he would always be there to protect the two of them. And now she knew he'd been murdered, his life stolen simply because he dared to fight for justice. "Those bastards," Maddie whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes igniting with anger. "You have to let me help." Cassandra shook her head immediately. "No, Maddie. This is dangerous. Cole will do anything. I can't let you get involved." But Maddie wasn't a child who could be talked into obedience. She looked straight into her sister's eyes, her voice harder than Cassandra had ever heard it. "What do you think I'm studying IT for? I can hack. I can find information. I can trace things normal people can't. Ethan was my family too, and I'm not as fragile as you think." The sisters stared at each other in silence, a wordless battle of will. In the end, Cassandra gave in. Not because she wanted to, but because she knew Maddie would do it with or without permission. And at least if Cassandra agreed, she could supervise her and keep her as safe as possible. "All right," Cassandra said, "but you have to promise me, if there's any sign of danger, you stop immediately." Maddie nodded, then opened her laptop and went straight to work. She asked what Cassandra wanted her to look for first. Cassandra thought for a moment, then said she wanted to know why Gabriel's legal team had withdrawn all at once. They said they'd been threatened, but who threatened them? And how? Maddie's fingers flew across the keyboard, windows opened and closed on the screen. Lines of code streaming past like a waterfall. She'd taught herself programming when she was 14. At first out of curiosity, then it grew into a real passion, a genuine gift. She wasn't a professional hacker, but she was skilled enough to get past ordinary security walls. After nearly 2 hours, Maddie suddenly looked up, her eyes bright. "I found it," she said, her voice shaking with excitement and fury. Thornton's legal team received threatening emails 2 weeks ago. They included photos of their families, their home addresses, their kids' schools, and a warning that if they kept representing Gabriel, their loved ones would have accidents. Cassandra felt cold go down her spine and asked if Maddie could trace the sender. Maddie nodded. She said the email had been sent through an anonymous server, but she traced back to the original IP address, and it led to a company called Crescent Holdings, registered in Delaware. Cassandra frowned and asked what Crescent Holdings was. Maddie kept typing, then answered that it was a shell company, no real business activity. But when she dug deeper into the ownership structure, it connected to another company in the Cayman Islands, and that company was owned by Cole Enterprises. Cassandra went still. This was the first piece of proof that Cole was directly involved in sabotaging the case. And if they could find this, they could find much more. The third day of the trial began differently from the moment Cassandra walked into the federal courthouse in Manhattan. Instead of the janitor's uniform or the worn office clothes with frayed shoulders she'd worn the previous 2 days, that morning she found a large box placed outside the door of her apartment in the Bronx, with a card that carried no signature. Inside was a women's suit in deep navy, the fabric so smooth and soft she'd never touched anything like it in her life, along with a pair of black high heels that fit perfectly, as if they'd been measured for her alone. Cassandra knew immediately who had sent it. Only Gabriel Thornton could have known her exact jacket size and shoe size without asking, because he was the kind of man who watched every detail around him, even the ones most people dismissed as unimportant. She hesitated before deciding to wear it, not because she wanted to accept a gift from him, but because she understood that in a courtroom, appearance was a weapon too, and she needed every weapon she could get to survive this fight. When she stepped into the courtroom, Gabriel was already seated at the defense table, and she caught his gray eyes flick over her for the briefest moment with something almost like satisfaction before he returned to his usual cold composure. The third day moved with more tension than the first two. Richard Graves presented 3 more witnesses, each one delivering testimony that harmed Gabriel with the steady confidence of someone carefully trained for the role. But Cassandra wasn't the naive young woman she'd been 7 years ago. She'd learned from hundreds of trials she'd watched as an invisible janitor. She knew how to ask questions that cornered a witness inside the contradictions of their own words. She knew how to read body language well enough to sense when someone was lying. One by one, she peeled apart the holes in their stories, not with aggression, but with calm precision and logic as sharp as a blade. When court adjourned that afternoon, Graves left the courtroom with his face flushed red with anger, and the jury looked at Cassandra with an expression where she could see respect beginning to take shape. Afterward, Gabriel asked to meet her privately in the small room behind the courtroom, the same room where they'd spoken for the first time 3 days earlier. This time, the air between them was different. No longer the strained clash of two strangers, but something that came close to trust, even if neither of them was ready to admit it. "You did well today," Gabriel said, his voice still low and even, yet carrying a sincerity she hadn't heard from him before. "Does the suit fit?" Cassandra met his gaze instead of avoiding those hard gray eyes, and answered that she didn't need him buying clothes for her. Gabriel gave a slight shrug and said he knew she didn't need it, but he wanted to. And in this war, he wanted his lawyer to look like a warrior, not a victim. Cassandra was silent for a moment. Then she said what she'd carried inside her for 7 years, that she'd lost everything. Mr. Thornton, her husband, her career, her name, that she'd lived 7 years like a ghost inside her own life, that she had nothing left to fear, and that was why she could stand here today. Gabriel watched her, and in that moment the cold wall he'd built around himself seemed to crack just a little. He said she had a sister, she had Maddie, and that was something she could still lose, and he wanted her to know he would protect Maddie. Not because Cassandra asked, but because it was the right thing to do. Cassandra felt her throat tighten. She asked why he would do that, why he cared. Gabriel turned his face away, looking toward the small window of the room, his voice lowering as he began to tell a story. Very few people knew that 15 years earlier he'd had a younger sister named Lily, a 17-year-old girl, bright and full of dreams, and one day she'd accidentally seen Cole's men moving contraband at the harbor near their home. That was all, just seeing it. And 1 week later, her car lost control on the way to school and went over a cliff. The police called it an accident, but he knew the truth. Cassandra stood there, her chest aching as she listened to Gabriel's story. She understood now. She understood why he'd built a shadow empire, why he held to unbreakable rules, why he was willing to wait 15 years for revenge instead of acting on impulse. He and she were more alike than she'd ever imagined. Two people who'd had the most beloved person in their lives stolen by Cole. Two people burning with the same hunger for justice. "That's why I understand you," Gabriel said, turning back to her. And in his gray eyes there was no longer only coldness, but a pain buried for too long. "You and I carry the same wound, and maybe that's why fate brought you into that courtroom that day." Cassandra didn't speak. She simply stood there in that small room under the harsh fluorescent light, and for the first time since Ethan died, she felt she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. That night, Cassandra was invited to Gabriel's office at Thornton Tower to discuss strategy for the next days of trial. She arrived at 9 o'clock in the evening, after making sure Maddie had gotten back to the dorm safely, and Ronan escorted her up to the 59th floor, where the command center of the Thornton Empire was located. This office was different from the luxurious penthouse above. It was more practical, with large computer screens, a city map pinned on the wall, and the tense air of a war room. Gabriel was seated behind his desk, reviewing a thick stack of documents, when the security system suddenly erupted with a piercing alarm. Red lights flashed across the room, and on the surveillance monitor appeared the image of a man hurriedly yanking a USB drive from a computer in the server room on a lower floor. Ronan recognized him instantly, and his face changed. It was Derek Lawson, Gabriel's right hand for 8 years, the man trusted with the most critical secrets of the Thornton Syndicate. Less than 5 minutes later, Derek was marched into the office by 2 guards, still holding the USB full of the data he'd tried to steal. His face was pale as paper, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes dodged Gabriel's gaze as if he couldn't bear to face the man he'd betrayed. Gabriel rose and stepped in front of Derek with a calm that was more terrifying than any fury. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, those gray eyes cold as ice, looking straight through the traitor. In Gabriel's world, that silence was worse than shouting, because it meant the death sentence had already been passed without a single word. Derek collapsed to his knees, his voice shaking as he begged Gabriel to let him explain, saying he had no choice. They had taken his mother. She was 72 years old and was being held somewhere, and if he didn't do what they said, they would kill her. Gabriel asked who they were, his voice steel cold. Derek said they were Harrison Cole's people, that 6 months ago they approached him, showed him a video of his mother tied up in a dark room, and told him that if he wanted her alive, he had to provide information about the Thornton Syndicate, about business strategy, about everything. He said he didn't know what to do. He said he was sorry. He said he was truly sorry. Cassandra stood in the corner, witnessing it all with her heart pounding. She saw that Ronan had drawn his gun, ready and waiting for Gabriel's order. She saw 2 other guards in a posture prepared to act, and she saw Derek Lawson, a man in his 30s with a hardened face, kneeling on the floor and crying like a child because he couldn't protect his mother. Gabriel stood motionless for a long time, his gray eyes never leaving Derek. In the underworld, betrayal was punishable by death, with no exceptions, no mercy. He'd executed traitors before without hesitation, because that was the only way to keep order in his empire. But today, something was different. He looked toward Cassandra, the woman standing in the shadows with green eyes that didn't judge, but didn't plead either. Then he remembered what she'd said in the courtroom, about justice, about truth, about how no one should be condemned without a chance to defend themselves. "Ronan," Gabriel said, his voice still calm but changed in a way that couldn't be missed. "Lower your gun." Ronan stared at him in disbelief and asked if his boss was sure, because this man had betrayed them. Gabriel nodded and said he knew, but Derek was a victim too. Cole had used his mother as a hostage, and in that situation anyone could do the same. He turned back to Derek, his voice firm but no longer ice-cold, and said he would give him one chance, not because he forgave him, but because someone was teaching him that justice didn't have to be soaked in blood. Derek lifted his head, eyes red, and asked what Gabriel wanted him to do. Gabriel said Derek would keep acting as Cole's spy, but from now on the information Derek gave them would be exactly what Gabriel wanted them to know, and in return Ronan would find and rescue Derek's mother. And did he accept? Derek nodded again and again, tears streaming, saying he accepted. He would do anything. Thank you, boss." When Derek was taken away, Cassandra stepped up beside Gabriel, her voice gentle as she asked why he hadn't killed him. Gabriel looked at her, and his gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They held something more complicated, and he said it was because she had shown him there was another way, that real strength wasn't in killing people, it was in turning an enemy into an ally. 2 days after Derek Lawson became a double agent, Maddie received something priceless from him, an IP address and a password for accessing the internal system of Cole Enterprises, the very access Derek had been given to file his reports. It was the back door she needed, the door straight into the black heart of Harrison Cole's empire. Maddie worked for 3 nights in a row in the tiny Bronx apartment, her laptop burning hot on her thighs, cold coffee sitting beside her, her eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness, yet never stopping as they scanned line after line of code and layer after layer of security. She built a hidden path to slip inside without being detected, like a ghost gliding through digital walls without leaving a trace. And what she found was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. On the 3rd night, Maddie called Cassandra in a shaking voice and told her she had to come right away, that she'd found something terrible. Cassandra contacted Gabriel immediately, and an hour later, all 3 of them were sitting in the penthouse of Thornton Tower, in front of Maddie's laptop, where thousands of pages of Cole Enterprises' confidential documents filled the screen. Maddie began to lay it out, her voice serious, like a professional intelligence analyst rather than a 19-year-old student, saying that this lawsuit wasn't only meant to defeat Mr. Thornton, it was part of a much larger plan, because Cole wanted to seize control of the entire port system along the east coast of the United States. She pulled up a digital map, pointed to 3 bright red dots on the screen, and explained that Thornton Industries owned the 3 largest ports on the East Coast, the Port of Newark in New Jersey, the Port of Baltimore in Maryland, and the Port of Norfolk in Virginia. Those 3 ports controlled more than 60% of the imported cargo flowing into the region, and if Cole took them through asset seizure after the lawsuit, he would gain full control over the transatlantic weapons smuggling route. Gabriel frowned, saying he'd known Cole had coveted those ports for a long time, but he hadn't believed Cole would dare to use the legal system to steal them so openly. Maddie nodded and continued, saying it was because Cole had powerful backing, and then she opened another series of documents that showed transfer records and call recordings. Cole had relationships with 3 senators on the Committee on Commerce and 2 federal judges, and he had paid millions of dollars to bribe them over the course of 10 years. This was proof they had interfered in lawsuits to benefit Cole, including their case. Cassandra felt a chill run through her. She'd known Cole was dangerous, but the extent of his power and manipulation went far beyond what she'd imagined. He wasn't just a criminal businessman, he was an octopus, with arms reaching into every corner of the American political and legal system. Then Maddie stopped, her face paling as she looked at Cassandra, and said there was one more thing. She had found an old file in the system, stored from 7 years ago and locked behind multiple layers of encryption, and it had taken her nearly a full day to open it, and when she finished reading, she understood why they had tried so hard to hide it. She pulled the file up on the screen, and Cassandra felt her heart stop. Maddie discovered that Cole's team hadn't just destroyed Ethan's files. They had digitized and encrypted them within their own private Project Liquidation High Risk as a trophy of their victory and a reference to ensure no loose ends remained. And on the final page, there was an internal note from Cole Enterprises stating that the subject, Ethan Whitmore, had collected enough evidence to endanger operations that he needed to be handled before the hearing date, that the method would be a traffic accident to be carried out by a special team, with the execution date set for April 11th, 2018. Cassandra read those lines, and the world around her seemed to collapse. She had known her husband was killed. She had read Gabriel's file about it, but seeing the assassination order written out in cold office language, as if it were an ordinary business transaction, was something else entirely. They had planned to kill Ethan as if he were merely a number to be erased. Not a human being with dreams, with a family, with a wife waiting at home. Tears began to run down Cassandra's cheeks. For the first time in 7 years, she had locked that pain deep in her chest for all that time, turning it into strength just to survive each day. But now, with the truth sitting right in front of her, every wall she had built shattered, she cried without sound, her shoulders shaking in waves, and 7 years of suffering poured out like a waterfall she could no longer hold back. Gabriel stood beside her, saying nothing, not touching her, only staying there like a solid rock in the middle of the storm. And Maddie wrapped her arms tightly around her sister, tears spilling down her own cheeks, whispering that they would make them pay, that Ethan would be cleared, and that she promised. 1 week after the night, Maddie uncovered Ethan's investigative dossier inside the Cole Enterprises system. Derek Lawson delivered a gift even more valuable than anything they could have hoped for. He showed up at Gabriel's penthouse at midnight, a black iPhone in his hand, sweat soaking his forehead as if he'd just run a marathon straight through hell. Derek explained that Cole had thrown a party at his Hamptons estate tonight, that Derek had been invited to report in person on the progress of the lawsuit, and that while Cole, drunk, disappeared into a bedroom with a young woman, Derek stole the personal phone Cole always kept on him, the one that held his darkest secrets and was never connected to the company network. Gabriel took the phone, and his gray eyes glinted with something dangerous as he understood what he was holding. He called Cassandra and Maddie immediately, and when the group gathered in the office, Maddie started cracking the phone with fierce concentration. It took nearly 2 hours to break through every layer of security, but when the final screen opened, what appeared on it dropped the entire room into a heavy silence. Inside the phone was a trove of proof, enough to drag Harrison Cole and his whole empire down into hell. Thousands of messages with politicians about bribes and the bills that needed to be pushed through. Emails detailing illegal weapons deals with terrorist organizations in the Middle East. Recordings of secret meetings with 2 federal judges presiding over cases that benefited Cole. And a list of people who'd been eliminated for standing in his way, with specific notes about the method and the date it was carried out. Cassandra sat there, her heart pounding, as Maddie scrolled through page after page of messages. Then she saw it, a text sent on April 10th, 2018, 2 days before Ethan died. The sender was Cole. The recipient was a number with no saved name. The message contained only a few words, cold enough to make your skin crawl. Handle Whitmore. Make it look like an accident. Finish before the 12th. And beneath it, a reply sent on April 12th. Done. No witnesses. Police ruled it an accident due to a blown tire. Cassandra read those lines, and the world around her seemed to disappear. She'd known Cole killed Ethan. She'd read the files. She'd seen the evidence. But seeing this message, seeing the order to kill her husband written in barely a handful of words, as casually as ordering something online, was something else entirely. She couldn't breathe, her chest tightening as if a fist had closed around it, and before she could control herself, she folded over the table, shoulders shaking, a strangled sob tearing up from deep in her throat. Maddie wrapped her arms around her at once, tears streaming down her own face, and the 2 sisters clung to each other and wept in that room filled with evidence of the crimes committed by the man who'd stolen the person they loved most. Gabriel stood beside them, silently watching, his gray eyes darkening with a pain he understood too well. Then he did something he hadn't done for anyone in 15 years. He stepped to Cassandra and placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but steady, a small gesture that held more compassion than words could ever carry. Cassandra lifted her head, green eyes red with tears. And in that moment she saw something in Gabriel she'd never seen before. Tenderness beneath the cold shell, the grief of a man who'd lost his sister in the same way, and the understanding of a wounded soul that matched her own. That night, after Maddie fell asleep in the penthouse living room, Cassandra stepped out onto the balcony and let the cold Manhattan wind brush against her tear-stained face. She wasn't surprised when she heard footsteps behind her, and Gabriel came to stand beside her, the two of them looking out at the city glittering below. "Tomorrow is the final day," Cassandra said, her voice raw, after hours of crying. "We have all the evidence we need, but I'm still scared. Scared Cole will find a way out. Scared justice will be crushed again." Gabriel turned to her, and his gray eyes weren't steel cold anymore. They looked warmer under the moonlight, and he said Cole wouldn't escape. He promised her that, and no matter what happened, he would protect her and Maddie at any cost. He'd lost his sister to Cole, and he wouldn't let Cassandra lose anyone else. Cassandra looked at him, and in that moment, in the cold midnight air on the penthouse balcony, she felt an invisible thread pulling the two of them together. Not love, not yet, but something deeper, an understanding between two wounded souls, and an unspoken promise that they would face the coming storm together. At 4 o'clock in the morning on the final day of trial, Ronan's phone rang with a shrill insistence that shattered the stillness in Gabriel's penthouse. A message from the security team watching Cassandra's apartment in the Bronx reported a break-in. Intruders had been inside for about 10 minutes before they were detected, and when the security team rushed in, the men vanished into the night. Cassandra heard the news and felt a cold blade slide down her spine. Even though she and Maddie had been staying at the penthouse at Gabriel's insistence for the past 3 days, the thought of her small apartment being violated still made her shudder. Gabriel immediately sent Ronan to check the scene, and an hour later the head of security returned with his jaw set hard and a box in his hands. He placed it on the table and lifted the lid, and inside was Cassandra and Ethan's wedding photograph, the one thing she'd carried from her old life, now torn into dozens of jagged pieces. Along with it was a slip of paper bearing a message written in red ink like blood. "Back off or die like your husband." Cassandra stared at the shredded fragments of that wedding photo, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with rage. For 7 years, she had lived in the dark, endured loss and humiliation, and now they thought they could threaten her by tearing apart the last relic of her husband. She lifted her head, green eyes burning with resolve, and said they were still going to court. She would not retreat. Gabriel nodded. He hadn't expected anything else from this woman. He ordered Ronan to prepare the convoy with the highest level of security. 3 armored SUVs, 12 fully armed guards, and an alternate route to the courthouse to avoid any possible ambush. They left the penthouse at 7 o'clock in the morning, the air still dim with mist, Manhattan streets quieter than usual at that hour. Cassandra sat in the middle SUV with Gabriel and Maddie, the girl clutching the laptop that held all the evidence they would present in court today. No one spoke, the air heavy with tension and the sense that something was coming. They were about halfway there when Ronan suddenly shouted over the radio that there was an ambush ahead. Cassandra looked through the window and her heart seemed to stop. 3 black armored vehicles blocked the road, and dozens of men in black poured out, masked, carrying assault rifles. These weren't street thugs. They moved with the synchronized precision of professional mercenaries, paid killers who would finish the job at any cost. Ronan yelled for the driver to reverse, but it was too late. 2 more SUVs had sealed them in from behind, trapping them like prey in a snare. Gunfire exploded, rounds slamming into the armored body with a screeching hailstorm sound. The bulletproof glass shuddered but held. Gabriel's guards spilled out and returned fire, and the quiet street turned into a battlefield in an instant. Cassandra pulled Maddie tight against her, her body shielding her sister, her pulse pounding out of control as shots cracked all around them. Gabriel drew a handgun from inside his suit jacket, checked the magazine, then turned to Cassandra with gray eyes harder than ever. He said that if anything happened, she had to run, not look back, get Maddie to the courthouse and present the evidence. That was what mattered most. Cassandra shook her head, her voice trembling but unyielding, and said no. She couldn't lose anyone else. She'd lost Ethan. She'd lost everything. She couldn't watch another person die because of her. Gabriel looked at her, and in that chaos, amid gunfire and shouting, he saw something in the tear bright green of her eyes that he had never seen in anyone before. A real concern for him, not because he was a powerful kingpin or a billionaire, but simply because he was Gabriel, the human being beneath all the armor. The fight dragged on for nearly 10 minutes, long as a lifetime for the people inside the SUV. Ronan and the guards fought fiercely, but they were being overwhelmed by numbers. 2 men were already wounded, and the ring was tightening. Cassandra thought this was the end, that she would die without bringing Cole to justice, that Ethan would never be cleared. Not truly, not in the eyes of the world. Then she heard sirens rip through the air. Not one, but dozens. Police cars and black SUVs with the letters FBI blazing on their sides, flooding in from every direction, surrounding the mercenaries like wolves closing a circle. Special Agent Thomas Reed, the man Gabriel had been tracking their convoy's GPS signal as part of a witness protection detail. He leapt from the lead vehicle with his weapon drawn and shouted that it was the FBI. "Drop your weapons. You are surrounded." The mercenaries realized the situation was hopeless. Some ran, some threw down their guns and surrendered, and within minutes the battle was over. Cassandra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, tears streaming down her cheeks without her noticing, and when Gabriel placed a hand on her shoulder to confirm she was safe, she realized she was shaking uncontrollably. They had survived, and now it was time to drag everything into the light. Cassandra walked into the courtroom at 9 o'clock that morning, only 30 minutes later than scheduled after the horrific ambush. She was still wearing the navy suit Gabriel had given her, but now it was wrinkled and dust-smeared, a long scratch running from her temple down her left cheek, where a shard of glass had struck her during the gunfight, and her auburn hair had broken loose from the neat bun she'd worn earlier. But her green eyes still burned with resolve, fiercer than ever, because she'd come too far to stop, lost too much to surrender. And today was the day. 7 years of waiting would finally end. The moment she stepped through the courtroom doors, every head turned. A wave of murmurs rolled through the room like surf, and reporters hammered at their keyboards as they took in her battered appearance. Cassandra didn't care about any of it. She focused on one person alone, sitting in the back row, Harrison Cole. His face went pale as paper when he saw she was alive, his eyes widening in disbelief before hardening into fear as he realized the ambush had failed and she was still standing there, ready to drag him down into hell. Judge Chen struck the gavel for order, her expression stern, but her eyes flickering with concern as they landed on the cut on Cassandra's face. She asked whether Miss Whitmore needed medical attention and whether she could continue in her condition. Cassandra shook her head. Her voice rang out clear and steady. "Your Honor," she could continue, and she had new evidence that needed to be presented immediately, evidence that would change this entire case. Richard Graves sprang up, objecting that the defense couldn't introduce new evidence at the last minute without prior notice to the prosecution. Cassandra turned to Graves, her eyes cold as ice, and said she believed Mr. Graves would be very interested in this evidence, because it involved him directly. Graves's face shifted for an instant, but he forced his composure back into place and asked what she was implying. Judge Chen ordered Cassandra to proceed, and Cassandra opened the case Maddie had prepared, filled with printed copies of hundreds of pages of evidence pulled from Harrison Cole's phone. She handed the documents to the court clerk and began. "Your Honor, and members of the jury, this is evidence that the entire lawsuit is a conspiracy staged by Harrison Cole, Chief Executive Officer of Cole Enterprises, designed to seize the assets of Thornton Industries, specifically the 3 largest ports on the east coast of the United States, to serve his transnational weapons smuggling operation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and shouted objections from Cole's side. But Cassandra didn't stop. She walked through the evidence piece by piece. Emails discussing bribes paid to 3 senators and 2 federal judges, recordings of secret meetings about weapons deals, and a list of people Cole had ordered killed for daring to stand in his way. Then she paused, her voice lowering as she reached the most painful part. "And here, Your Honor, is a message from Harrison Cole's personal phone ordering the assassination of my husband, Attorney Ethan Whitmore, on April 10th, 2018. The words were, 'Handle Whitmore, make it look like an accident.' And 2 days later, Ethan died in a car crash the police ruled was caused by a blown tire." Cole shot to his feet, his face flushed red with rage, shouting that the evidence was fabricated, that it was a scheme by Thornton to frame him, demanding that the court strike everything. But Cassandra wasn't finished. She turned to Graves, her gaze sharp as a knife, and said there was more. "Your Honor, Cole's phone also contained records of a $2 million transfer to prosecutor Richard Graves to ensure he would win this case at any cost." Graves went ashen. He stammered denials, but when Cassandra produced a copy of the bank transfer, showing the recipient's name in plain print, he froze in his seat like a statue. Judge Chen pounded the gavel repeatedly to restore order in a courtroom spiraling into chaos, her face harder than ever as she declared that based on the evidence presented, The court was dismissing all charges against Mr. Gabriel Thornton and ordering the United States Marshals to immediately arrest Harrison Cole on charges of bribery, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal weapons trafficking, and to arrest prosecutor Richard Graves on charges of accepting bribes and obstructing justice. The courtroom doors opened, and 4 marshals stepped in, cold handcuffs locking around Harrison Cole's wrists while he kept screaming that he would sue all of them, that they didn't know who they were dealing with. Cassandra stood there and watched the man who had murdered her husband, led away in irons, and 7 years of tears, 7 years of suffering, 7 years of waiting in the dark like an invisible ghost. All of it was worth this moment. She turned to Gabriel, the man standing at the defense table with gray eyes shining with something close to pride, and she knew justice had finally arrived. Not only for Ethan, but for Lily, Gabriel's sister, and for every innocent life Cole had stolen. 2 weeks after the historic trial, Cassandra Whitmore's life changed completely in a way she never could have imagined. The story of a janitor who stood up to defend a mafia boss and exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history spread across every headline, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, from CNN to Fox News, and her face appeared on every broadcast with the title of a hero of justice. Dozens of the most prestigious law firms in the United States sent her offers, 6-figure salaries, promises of fast advancement, the very opportunities she'd once dreamed of 7 years earlier before they were ripped from her with ruthless cruelty. But Cassandra refused them all. She'd seen too clearly how the legal system could be twisted by money and power. She'd watched expensive lawyers sell their conscience to serve the wealthy, and she didn't want to become part of that world. She wanted to build something different, something Ethan would have been proud of if he were still alive. One afternoon, Gabriel handed her a key and an address in the heart of Manhattan, offering no explanation, only telling her to go and see. Cassandra arrived and stopped cold in front of a 5-story building with an old red brick facade, and on the main door there was a brand new sign that read, "Whitmore and Associates, Pro Bono Law Office." She turned back to Gabriel behind her, eyes wide with disbelief, and asked what he had done. Gabriel shrugged, his voice calm as if he'd bought a cup of coffee instead of a building in Manhattan, and said it wasn't a gift, it was an investment. He believed in her. He believed she would use this place to help people who couldn't afford lawyers, the way she had once helped him, and that was something worth investing in. That same week, Maddie received her own piece of good news when Special Agent Thomas Reed called to tell her the FBI had accepted her application, based on the impressive hacking ability she'd shown during the Cole investigation, and on Reed's direct recommendation. She would begin training at Quantico in the fall, the first step toward becoming a cybersecurity specialist for the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country. Cassandra held her sister and cried, not from sadness, but from pride, because the orphaned 12-year-old girl she'd once protected had grown up and found her own path. On a Sunday morning, Cassandra went to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where Ethan had rested for 7 years. She laid a bouquet of white roses on his grave, sat down beside the headstone carved with his name, and for the first time in 7 years, she spoke to Ethan not with anger or suffering, but with peace. She told him about the trial, about Cole being arrested and now facing life in prison, about justice finally being done for him and for every other innocent person Cole had destroyed. Then she said what she'd been carrying in her heart for weeks, that she was ready to live again, that she would never forget him, that she would love him forever, but she couldn't stay frozen in the past, that he would want her to be happy, and she thought she'd found someone who could give her that. That night, Gabriel came to pick her up and told her he wanted to take her somewhere special. They drove across the Brooklyn Bridge into an older neighborhood of gray brick buildings and shadowed alleys Cassandra had never set foot in. Gabriel stopped in front of a rundown 5-story apartment building, paint peeling, windows boarded up, then led her up a rusted fire escape until they stood on the roof, looking out at Manhattan glittering across the river like a sea of lights. He told her about his childhood, about the one-room apartment where he'd lived with his mother and Lily, about nights when hunger gnawed at them because his mother worked 3 jobs and still couldn't afford enough food, about his father who'd left when Gabriel was 5 and never came back. He told her about Lily, the bright girl with a smile like sunlight, about her dream of becoming a doctor, and about the day he received word she'd died in a car crash he knew wasn't an accident. He told her about his mother, a woman worn down by grief who died only 2 years later, leaving him alone at 22 with a heart full of hatred and a vow of revenge at any cost. Cassandra listened, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she understood that Gabriel wasn't only the cold mafia boss the world imagined. He was a poor, orphaned boy who'd grown up in loss, just like her, and had used that pain to build an empire, the way she'd used her own pain to keep breathing through each day. "I lost everything," he said, his voice low and rough in the night wind. "But you showed me there's another way, that justice doesn't have to be drenched in blood, that you can find light even in the deepest darkness. You changed me, Cassandra, and I don't know how to thank you." Cassandra turned to him, green eyes meeting gray under the moon, and she told him she didn't need his thanks. She only needed him here, beside her. Gabriel lifted a hand and gently brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. And in that moment, on the old rooftop where he'd once sat alone, staring at the stars and dreaming of a better life, he bent down and kissed her. The first kiss of two wounded souls finding each other in the night, while Manhattan glittered below like millions of stars blessing them. 1 year later, morning sunlight slipped through the glass wall of the Thornton Tower penthouse, waking Cassandra Whitmore from the most peaceful sleep she'd had in 8 years. She opened her eyes and found herself in Gabriel's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, steady and soothing like a lullaby. 1 year earlier, she'd been an invisible janitor in the federal courthouse in Manhattan, living in a cramped Bronx apartment on a monthly wage of $4,200, her heart covered in scars. Now she woke each morning beside the man who'd given her a reason to believe in love again, in a penthouse overlooking all of Manhattan, with a life she'd never dared to dream of. Gabriel had been awake for a long time, gray eyes watching her with a tenderness the outside world never got to see. He told her there was something he wanted to ask, then reached for a small velvet box he'd hidden beneath the pillow the night before. When he opened it, Cassandra saw a simple ring with a small diamond, not the $1 million jewelry people would expect from a billionaire, but an older ring with a classic design, faded by time. Gabriel explained that it had been his mother's ring, the only thing she'd left him before she died, and he'd kept it for 15 years, waiting for the woman worthy of wearing it, and that woman was her, Cassandra. Would she become his wife? Tears streamed down Cassandra's cheeks as she nodded and said yes, 1,000 times yes. Gabriel slid the ring onto her finger, and in that moment, two wounded souls found a quiet harbor in each other. That afternoon, Cassandra walked into the federal courtroom in Manhattan, not as a janitor or a defendant, but as defense counsel for a young woman being framed for fraud by the very company she worked for. Her client's story made Cassandra think of herself 8 years earlier, a gifted woman crushed by the system simply for daring to stand against the powerful. She glanced toward the back row and saw Maddie sitting there in an FBI trainee uniform, and beside her Gabriel in a black suit, both of them smiling at her in steady encouragement. Cassandra turned back to the jury, drew a deep breath, and began her argument. She said that justice didn't depend on the price of the suit you wore or the name of the law firm you hired. It depended on the truth and on the courage of those willing to stand up and defend it. As she stood there before 12 faces in the jury box, Cassandra realized her life had come full circle. From a hopeful Harvard law student, to a widow stripped of everything, to an invisible janitor in the dark, and now a lawyer standing up for the vulnerable, the way she once had been. She thought to herself that from the deepest breaking, we can build the most beautiful thing, and that was the lesson life had taught her through 8 years of suffering and waiting. Cassandra Whitmore's story reminds all of us that no night lasts forever, that justice can arrive late, but it will arrive, that love can bloom even in hearts that have been wounded, and that any one of us, whether a janitor holding a mop or the most powerful kingpin in the city, deserves a second chance in life. If this story touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button on our channel, press like, and share this video with the people you love so they can hear moving stories like this every day. We'd truly love to know how you feel about Cassandra and Gabriel's story, whether it reminds you of anything in your real life, and which lesson from it made you reflect the most. Please leave a comment below so we can hear what's in your heart, because every story is only complete when someone listens and shares. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Remember that no matter how hard life gets, hold on to your faith and never give up hope, because as Cassandra proved, miracles can happen at the exact moment you think everything is over. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.